To me, the thing that's most compelling is this kind of way he can imagine a world, conjure up a universe, whether it's ancient myth or biblical stories or ancient texts. It all feels entirely plausible and you feel part of it. This idea of Poussin as someone who is looking around all the time, thinking about other painters, other art, he is involved in the preparation of a French translation of some of Leonardo da Vinci's writing, specifically his interest in light. And it's like a hidden kind of code inside this picture. And what's going on here has to do with Poussin's interest in Leonardo's study. And so look at these compound shadows and...
Yeah, I was going to say the double shadows that you get, kind of one and then another, you know, the play of these different light sources.
Hi, I'm Larry Keith. I'm Head of Conservation and Keeper at the National Gallery. You're in the Conservation Studios, and I'm here with my colleague.
Hi, I'm Francesca. I am the acting curator of later Italian, Spanish and French pictures here at the National Gallery, which means I'm the curator who looks after 17th century French paintings, like the two by Poussin that we have here.
And so it's a special moment, a double Poussin experience. We have two pictures in the Conservation Studio, Cephalus and Aurora, an earlier work. You see it now after cleaning, before retouching. And the second is our newest acquisition, a depiction of the Eucharist from about just less than 10 years later. One has been in the gallery for nearly all of its 200-year existence, and the other is just entering the collection.
Looking at these, they're so clearly different. So it's fascinating to have this moment to see one artist across a decade in a totally different mode, as you said.
Yeah.
He's born in France at the end of the 16th century, but the vast majority of his working life is spent in Rome. And in his early years in Rome, this is much, much more the sort of thing he's painting. You know, these mythological scenes, beautiful soft colours. He's a very feeling painter for kind of warm flesh and bodies at this point of his career. And then at the end of the 1630s, there's this sort of, I mean, we kind of talk about it almost as a break for Poussin, that suddenly he's moving towards a very different kind of painting, which is much more rigorous, much more sort of geometric, much darker. And having these two together, it's the kind of perfect way to demonstrate that. For me, this is the kind of picture that's an excellent reminder for us to not characterize artists, you know, in general, but also not to think of them as just kind of one moment of their work. Poussin is often talked about as being a painter's painter. So he's an artist to whom, you know, since his lifetime, other artists have come back, generation upon generation of artists have come back to look at Poussin. And I think, you know, in these early pictures, that is partly about the kind of painterliness of them. And now, looking at this without that really yellowed varnish, you know, feeling as if we're really up close with the paint again. You know, I look at details like this and they're just really kind of, I don't know, scrummy, delicious, that's not the right word to say, but, you know, or the highlights in the hair here, or the way each of these little leaves of the laurel crown is picked out. They're so lively now and vibrant, you get such a better sense of it. The figure of Cephalus, the prince in the story who we see here, is, you know, almost directly quoted from our Titian, the Bacchus and Ariadne, which Poussin knew in Rome. It was in the Aldobrandini collection, and, you know, so we can immediately in this picture see, you know, a very, very clear kind of pinpoint moment of where he's looking at other artists. I mean, Rome, you know, in the 17th century, it's kind of the closest you can get to the classical world. You're surrounded by all these wonderful sculptures and bits of antiquity being dug up out of the ground around you. There are these wonderful palazzi filled with sculptures and painting and everything else. I
think he must have lived and breathed and thought continuously about classical culture and classical life in antiquity, and how it must have felt, what they would have read, what they would have thought, how they would have eaten, what rooms look like. It's all going on, even to such completely different storytelling ends, and again, different kind of painting technique as well.
But I don't know, to me, looking at this, I'm struck, you know, especially in this moment kind of after cleaning, before restoration, just how vibrant this is. I mean, this was a very yellow picture before you started working on it, right?
Yes, the reduction of the yellowed varnishes has really allowed something of Poussin's original ideas about color and color relationships to come through. Things like the different flesh tones between the god or the puto and the young man and young woman, all those kinds of relationships, the balance of the kind of red, yellow and blue, the tonal range from white to dark, all those things have really come out. You know, it sort of made me look again at the composition with new eyes, because I think we do, you know, art historically, you know, there is this kind of, has been this feeling that Poussin is kind of quite
cold, sort of unfeeling, very intellectual, not a very sensual painter. But then, I look at something like this with this amazing kind of entanglement of legs. So this is the prince Cephalus, who's really in love with his wife, Procris, whose portrait you see here. This is Aurora, the goddess of dawn, who is desperately in love with him. You can see she's kind of like sort of entwining her leg around his, and just the way Poussin's kind of had the jutting out of his ankle bone there, or the way the feet are positioned so that everyone's kind of almost touching. It's really amazing to get to see this now in this state. It is like looking at a different picture.
Some of the purest white you see is the highlight on the wing, which is the bit that's probably closest to you visually. I mean, all these kinds of orchestration of effect have really become much more apparent from the cleaning. A question that often arises is, given how these varnishes and retouchings that I'm removing have degraded and become yellow, what about the work we do now? Well, of course, we're using more stable materials, and most important, I think, is we're showing these pictures in an environment with little or no ultraviolet light, which is the main culprit in making varnishes degrade and yellow. And I'm quite confident that our restorations will last considerably longer than these. The gallery has an extraordinarily rich grouping of paintings by Poussin, and this has stood out for some time as being the only one that clearly has a very yellowed varnish. And so we wanted to do something about that, particularly in the context of our redisplay to celebrate our bicentennial. But what you see now is a picture that has got a lot of yellowed varnish. It was last cleaned in 1950, and you can see some of the early cleaning tests here showing the yellowed varnish being reduced or removed in those areas. And subsequent to those initial cleaning tests, one here as well, I've started to remove the varnish, broadly speaking, from left to right, and you can see a sort of contour line here coming down, showing where the varnish has come off to the left side. I think you can see immediately the differences it makes. What I'm going to do now is continue with the removal of the varnish, the old discolored retouchings. Then, once that's achieved, we'll be looking at revarnishing the work and doing new retouching on top of our varnish, retouching that's designed not to be visible in the galleries, but very clearly discernible in ultraviolet light and documented thoroughly. During the Second World War, the collection was evacuated to a slate mine in Wales, in a place called Maned, which is a fascinating chapter, in many ways obviously a very dark moment in the gallery's history, but some very interesting things came out of it. The decision was taken to put it there. Obviously it's a very safe and isolated place. Caves, essentially, being cold and wet, it was theorized that they could build structures inside and simply apply heat, and that would raise the temperature and reduce the humidity and provide unbelievably stable conditions for the collection, which it did. And I think the stability of the conditions in storage in Maned provided a very compelling argument for the subsequent introduction of air conditioning and climate control, and understanding of how important that is for the preservation of old master paintings, and that was proven in Maned. Unfortunately, in this case, this was one of the few pictures that had a handling accident when you consider the conditions under which everything was evacuated at haste in structures quickly built. It's perhaps not surprising, however unfortunate. And so we have this compound tear, which is described as being caused by falling slate in the quarry itself during that installation.
I suppose, in a way, though, we're lucky, although that obviously is significant. It could have been, a much more wholesale damage, and in a way, we're fortunate that that's where that is, and that most of the central figures actually are in very good condition. This is a picture painted still in Rome, as you said, but about a decade later. It's one of a series of 7 paintings of the sacraments, so the sacraments of the Christian faith. And they were incredibly famous. This series of paintings was incredibly well regarded in Poussin's day. It was so famous that someone else commissioned him to paint a second series. When these arrive in Britain in the 18th century, they are celebrity paintings. They're shown at the Royal Academy. They are considered to be this great triumphant acquisition. So we are absolutely thrilled that we now have one of them in the National Gallery's collection. And we can see here that this is the Eucharist. It's the breaking of the bread, or the blessing of the bread. So this is Christ in the middle, surrounded by the 12 disciples. You can see the plates laid out before them, the cup in his hand. I mean, it is just so strange to think that this is less than a decade later, and particularly when you have the two of them together and you know, just even the kind of warm blonde tonalities, the richness of the colour here, to then come to this space which is very sombre, very dark, very atmospheric. So we've moved away from, you know, the classical mythology, the story taken from Ovid there, into almost like a kind of a history painting of the early church in a way, isn't it? And I think for me, looking at the accuracy with which Poussin has depicted this, you know, the choice to have the figures in costumes that would have been, you know, contemporary costumes.
Yeah, plausible Roman
exactly,
era
you know, on Roman tricliniums, you know, these reclining tables, lying down to eat the meal in this space. It is to me about evoking a sort of real history. You know, it's interesting going back to the feet, having thought in Cephalus and Aurora about, you know, how carefully that's been choreographed. You know, I see that here, it's on a totally different scale, it's in a totally different setting, but still, you know, this care on Poussin's part to, you know, have this kind of arrangement, you know, these amazing feet coming towards us here, the fact that almost every disciple has a hand up, or there's a gesture, you know, whether it's, you know, a hand stopping to make somebody else quiet, to kind of witness this moment of blessing, or a hand here that looks like it's going to interject, or the sleeping hands here, you know, it's all so carefully picked out, it's so carefully choreographed. In a way, it's a painting about the space, right? And it's a painting about light. So I absolutely love that you can see the kind of pinhole in the picture here, from which all the kind of perspective is, or much of the perspective is being
compass for the
is being worked out, and you know, you've got this kind of, everything is really kind of radiating out from this focal point, I guess, just below where Christ is.
This picture has suffered a bit from some fine abrasion. That means tiny losses at the top of the texture of the canvas weave, probably caused by historic relining. And so the effect of that is to make a kind of little snowstorm, a little bit of loss, making everything a tiny bit blurry, like old TV screens.
Yeah,
right? Exactly,
yeah.
everywhere. And so just really putting on high magnification and zooming in and very carefully dotting out that noise, it makes such a huge difference. And it feels like all you're doing is unlocking what's there, making the thing quiet and letting Poussin be Poussin. And so it's been quite a painstaking treatment, but really satisfying in that regard.
This is the 15th Poussin to join the National Gallery's collection. We have early Poussins, we have some later Poussins, we have landscapes, we have bacchanals, you know, the kind of mythological scenes, but, you know, to have one of these of the most famous series, really, I think this kind of fills the gap that we didn't have before. So it's very thrilling.